And so it was always hard to get too excited about this ceasefire because it just looked more likely than not that it would go this way. That if the other side is saying to them, not that we're in a peace process where this will culminate in a Palestinian state, but if the answer is you are to be ruled in perpetuity, you are to be slaves forever, let's just say it makes it a lot more difficult for someone to tell them to be Gandhi.
Dave Smith just hammered Israel for breaking the ceasefire in Gaza, killing at least 80 Palestinians since the ceasefire began. What does this mean for the potential of peace in Israel and in Gaza? And what does it mean for the Trump administration that celebrated the ceasefire as a major victory? Let's get right into it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Anyway, I wish I wasn't vindicated on this one, but it really seems to be things seem to be deteriorating rather quickly. Israel, as of in the last 24 hours, has been heavily attacking from the air and the ground Gaza. They've killed a bunch of people. I think it was something like 60 or 70 people were killed yesterday, a bunch of innocent civilians. And so, obviously this was obviously it was just ridiculous to start celebrating as if the thing was over. And I think that the people who got way out over their skis on this, and we're talking about Donald Trump deserving a Nobel Peace Prize and historic peace deals and all this stuff, I mean, it always just seemed that this is, I mean, again, I would have preferred that they ended up being vindicated, but it just seemed like that was kind of, I'm not even trying to insult, maybe wishful thinking, you could describe it as, but just doesn't seem to be what the facts on the ground are bearing out. I try to be fair here. I think it's because there's a tendency on people to get into this tribal stuff or whatever. And it's interesting because with a lot of my critics, you see that they almost project that onto you. Just for example, if a Palestinian, whoever, if a Hamas guy does something brutal, they always seem to go, oh, you sure this is the side you're defending? And you're like, no, dude, you're just getting into this tribal game and pretending I'm defending Hamas. I've never done anything close to that.
And that's true of the vast majority of Israel's critics in the United States. Never defend Hamas. We saw that Pew Research poll I put on a video a few days ago showing that despite the loss of support for Israel, 8 out of 10 Americans on both sides of the political aisle do not support Hamas and have very negative opinions of Hamas. But at the same time, a minority of Americans now support Israel in a 50-point swing since October 7th. So Dave's exactly right about that, and he's not lying about these airstrikes. We got this awesome article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com talking about that 80 at least Palestinians have been killed from the IDF airstrikes. They unleashed a big barrage of them on Sunday. And we have one incident where 7 young children and 3 women were killed in a vehicle. And it is the case that Israel violated the ceasefire first. They sent only half the aid trucks they had promised to do in their ceasefire. And, they killed dozens of Palestinians before this happened. So this is the time in which we're living, in which the needs of the Palestinians weren't addressed, and Israel's needs weren't addressed either, because they want to annex and take over Gaza. So no sides of this were really, assuaged in any way by the ceasefire. It seemed to be a temporary reprieve to take some pressure off of Trump and Netanyahu, and it's going to be broken if it isn't completely broken already.
And look, what can you say here? Israel is claiming that Hamas violated the ceasefire, but Hamas is claiming they didn't. And then there's reports saying that there's been several reports that said that it was actually an unexploded, roadside weapon that was driven over. Who knows exactly what happened? Oftentimes you never figure out exactly what the truth was. But by the way, it certainly would not be crazy to me if I did find out that Hamas had violated the ceasefire. You do make a good point that it's you kind of judge based off the information you have, and you go, look, Israel's the one who was just taking out a negotiating team, right? They even apologized for this, right? And Hamas just turned over the last little bit of leverage that they have. So yes, it does seem like it would not follow that then they would immediately try to the way this thing was structured was Hamas has to give up their last little bit of leverage, and then Israel will decide if it wants to move back. So why on earth would Hamas give up the leverage and then, in the phase where they're counting on Israel deciding, intentionally provoke them out of it? Like, maybe there is an explanation to that, but certainly on the surface of it doesn't seem super likely.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, Hamas and even Israel's not a complete hive mind. I mean, the Israeli government is so much more coherent in its objectives and goals. This is a very tightly knit right-wing coalition in pursuit of this strategy of greater Israel in general, with Netanyahu several weeks ago saying that was near and dear to his heart, with Smotrich saying there will be settlements, Israeli settlements in Gaza. But at the same time, it's hard to know. And regardless of any of this, it's known that Israel broke the ceasefire first. They acknowledged not sending the full motorcade of trucks, of aid trucks, 600 as promised in the ceasefire at the start anyway. So whether or not it was violated, I mean, it being violated by murder is much more, of a tangible slap in the face than the curtailment of aid to some extent. But you have starving masses in Gaza, poor innocent Gazan children dying over this too.
But again, as is always the case here, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you would probably urge, if Palestinians in Gaza were listening to you, you would probably urge the same thing of them. Like, you'd go like, hey guys, a little bit of grace here. Like, if one IDF soldier shoots a rifle somewhere, that doesn't mean the whole thing's off, And just to be clear on this is something we do know. Israel has not stopped killing Palestinians the entire time. The numbers went down. They were killing less Palestinians, I think there were a couple days there where they only killed in the dozens, which is better than many dozens. But that's, my point is just that if you were looking for an excuse to say, hey, that's a violation of the ceasefire, you could find them on either side.
Exactly right. That's such an important point, and that has been happening throughout this ceasefire. Israel has continued to kill Palestinians, even before these assertions that Hamas had broken the ceasefire. I'm so glad Dave is making that point. And as I've continually said, what matters is what each side does in response to these ordeals that will make this ceasefire live and die. I didn't necessarily think it would be as short as 1 week, but it looks like that's what it's turning out to be, because the first ceasefire even lasted 2 months. And that must have kept Benjamin Netanyahu awake at night, wondering how many more people he could kill as soon as possible to complete the annexation of Gaza, which he still wants, and the ethnic cleansing, which a lot of the Likudniks don't even, have shame to try to hide anymore, especially Smotrich.
But again, none of that really is exactly the point. And I think, even if it was Hamas who violated the ceasefire, I think the point that we ultimately have to come back to, which has been my message through this whole thing, is that it's totally legitimate when you're trying to understand a conflict to put yourself in the Israeli shoes, to put yourself in the Palestinians' shoes, to try to see it from both their perspectives, and certainly understand how civilians on both sides could be led into, having certain views. But that ultimately, when we're deciding what policy we support, we come back to an American's perspective, because that's what we are. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the politics of the United States of America.
I wish our ruling class did that, but they think through the eyes of Israelis only. But thankfully, there are populist libertarians like Dave that do look at this from a real America First perspective, not the Zionist AIPAC-induced Israel firsters in this federal government.
And so from the American perspective, we want to see this thing end. That's kind of unanimous at this point, right? Everybody knows this is not good. This is not, Joe Biden wanted this to end. Donald Trump wants this to end. Kamala Harris wanted it to end. It's not good for us. And yet it's a policy that we're funding, that we're supporting. And now if this ceasefire does break down, we have to go right back to supporting something that's not in our interest. And then, of course, the other thing, which I did mention, because Israel had already started down this road on our last podcast last week, but now the reaction, as I must say again, because it's just it's too important to not harp on. And it kind of gives away the whole game here of the nature of this war. But the other thing that, like, yes, as you mentioned, Rob, yes, technically the ceasefire has not been officially broken. It is, right, as you said, not dead in the water, but perhaps wounded and flopping in the water. But a major part, like the best part of the ceasefire, or tied for the best part, was the hostages being released. But the other thing that's right up there was increased aid to Gaza, and Israel's just announced that they're cutting that off.
Yeah, and that's the Israel way. So instead of, saying that, hey, we're going against Hamas, we want to eliminate Hamas, they take their war against the Palestinian citizens. And if their bombing campaigns don't show that, the inhibition of their aid should certainly show that. And Dave was right about this too. When the ruling class in Washington is coming up with a list, a hierarchy, if you want to call it that, of their options and of their priorities, it's just the case that support for Israel is higher on that list of priorities and values than stopping a genocide. That's the sad truth. And it's both parties. It's the uniparty. The Zionists on the right are horrible about it. The liberal Zionists are horrible about it. You have some populist aberrations on both sides fighting against it. Thankful for them to raise a stink on this, and the American people overwhelmingly siding against this. A lot of Trump's base having big problems with it, but a lot of his base just doubling down and saying everyone in Gaza is Hamas. And, they're all human shields at that point. But that's true. That is what they're going with.
And so, like, again, it's such a blatant illustration of the way in which Israel conducts this war and the mentality that they have, that you could just go, okay, so let's say Hamas violated the ceasefire. And let's just say, possibly, Rob, that some members of Hamas violated the ceasefire, right? Like, even with a government, like with an official government, we know that every part of the government doesn't always work in coordination, and different factions have their own different, motives. But so if members of Hamas violated that, therefore Israel gets to just immediately punish the civilian population for that, and not punish them with, like, we're canceling your Netflix, or we're taking out Wi-Fi or something like that, but punish them with, like, these desperate war-torn people now don't get the aid that they need.
That's why it's a genocide. That's why this isn't a war. Israel views it as a war versus Palestinians. Netanyahu called them Amalek in his famous speech after October 7th, likening those entire people to those in the tribe in the Bible that the Israelites wiped out. That is what he sees as his war. It's not a war versus Hamas, despite the fact that he says that sometimes. They, in their actions, bring the war against the Palestinian populace in general, where no one is to be spared, and everyone's just called collateral damage or a human shield if they have to die because of these strikes. That's just the case.
It's just like, I think it's just very hard for anybody who's a civilized person to support that. It's, like, too horrible. As John Mearsheimer was on, he's done a couple interviews since the ceasefire. I always think he's a very interesting person to get his take from. And, he said it, and I think he's kind of right, was that he was basically just like, look, like, even if the immediate killing and dying in Gaza is paused, like, well, that's great. That's an improvement over this. But the fundamental realities on the ground, like, the fundamental problems are still all there, right? And, like, the fundamental problem here is that, well, look, Israel's had control since 1967 of these territories. These territories have millions of people in them. Israel does not wish, look, they'll all say it, right? Like, they'll say it I'd say 50% at least of the debates that I've done on the Israel-Palestine issue are getting down to me just forcing the person to say the thing that they're already saying in blunt terms. Because if you ask them, if you say to any of the people who support Israel, well, how about a two-state solution? They'll give you a million reasons why you can't have a two-state solution. And then if you go, well, how about a one-state solution? They'll give you a million reasons that you can't have a one-state solution, right? You can't have a two-state solution because you can't reward Hamas with a state, and Israel can't allow their neighbors to have a government that's going to launch rockets into them. Or then they'll say, well, how come it can't be a one-state solution? Well, because it wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore, and now there'd be a majority of Arabs in the region, and they would outvote the Jews or something. But so by default, they're like, well, what is the other answer? And that's the status quo.
It's always the status quo. You can't have any solution that might bring about peace. It has to go back to the status quo, which, by the way, is genocide. And Mearsheimer's right. And this is the reason why a lot of us didn't celebrate so enthusiastically when this ceasefire came. Yeah, a lot of us dissidents were really happy that there was, a quasi-temporary reprieve in the killing. Not as much so. Obviously, Israel has killed 80 Palestinians since this ceasefire began. But the easing of killing is a good thing. But at the same time, none of the conditions that would have quelled the animosities of each side against each other were satisfied by the ceasefire. So this is what we saw. This is why we weren't throwing jubilant celebrations and parades throughout our biggest cities, because we knew that the violence would resume. And many of us were Nostradamus-like prophets, I suppose, if we thought Israel would break the ceasefire, because they have.
That the other individuals.
Yeah, that you just rule over these people and they never have any rights of their own, that you are in control of the territory where millions of people live and they do not have citizenship or voting rights or the right to travel or trade or, anything. And so, if that's the ask,
if that's the ask, there's no hope for the Palestinians, because Netanyahu is so carved in on this that he'll never cave on it. It's his entire political ambition. Look, this is just an apartheid state. And if you think that, Gaza has some coherent government that's calling the shots and there's some war ministry conducting this war, it's just wrong. This is a subjugated people within Israel. It's a territory of Israel. It's not in Green Line Israel. And they're just second-class citizens in every way, up to and including being fodder for murder campaigns, for murder sprees by the IDF. That's just what this is. And the Israel First mentality in the United States enables that. I hate to say that. I think it's becoming less and less popular, but that's just where our tax dollars go. And I realize that this isn't the top priority of most Americans, but it is linked at the very least to the top priority of most Americans if they see, say, economic issues as a higher priority, like the costs of food and debt and the price of college tuition and fuel. It's all spurred about by debt and inflation that is used to finance these murder campaigns. Because that's what the war machine is. It's a mass murder campaign. That's why it's the worst kind of government problem. I'm a libertarian. I think all problems essentially related to government are a problem because they involve the initiation of force under a monopoly power that doesn't get consent from the governed to wield that power. And war is the worst in some ways because beyond being a waste of money, it's a mass murder spree. That's just what it is in Israel, just as it is in the proxy war in Ukraine, just as it is in the, assistance to the Saudi regime in the Yemeni blockade that's killed about 500,000 people, and very few people talk about that one. The same was the case in the 20-year occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. The war in Syria, the war in Libya. It's always a disaster, and that's what we're seeing in Gaza. Look, a lot of us were right that the ceasefire wouldn't last long. It looks like it's just about over. If they're going to entertain the prospect of extending it, we'll see. But just the killing continues, and that's what we're going to get from this. That's why we weren't celebrating so enthusiastically when this got unveiled. And we'll have to see how Trump reacts to this, because he was really saying that, Israel's not going to break the ceasefire. It will hold. And he's also said, well, if Hamas breaks the ceasefire, we'll wipe them out. I'll make sure of that. Well, we'll see. But this wasn't a triumph for the Trump administration. You didn't get away from this one. But I do want to hear from you. What do you think about Israel breaking the ceasefire? Is there any chance of this being salvaged for longer, or is this just over now? Will the genocide continue? Is Dave Smith right? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Dave. He has an awesome podcast, good friend of mine. Love the guy. And if you like this video and my other videos, please consider becoming a YouTube member. You can click the join button below to do that. If you support me that way, I really appreciate it. It means the world to me, honestly. And in return for that, if you do that, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.